So, how big is big? Well, Kazakhstan is the 9th biggest secret on the planet. The size of mainland Europe, yet you go outside of Kazakhstan and very few people know much about the country itself, for reasons both simple and complicated. And yet Kazakhstan is an incredible country with mountains and steppe, with a rich and varied history. And where would the world be without Kazakhstan? It invented a way of transport, revolutionized transport through the domestication of the horse. Where would Amsterdam be without tulips from Kazakhstan? And where, in our own country, some of our legends, the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, is fabled to be part of the a story of one of the knights, one of the cavalry from Kazakhstan traveling to England to help with the Romans protect against the Picts and the Caledonians in northern England. And so my relationship with Kazakhstan started just over 10 years ago. And I worked at the early stages of the Palace of Peace. And then more recently, I worked on the competition-winning scheme for the Green Bloc. And both these projects, obviously, in Astana, and that will be the focus, really, of my talk today. And so, for the country the size of Kazakhstan, it needs an impressive capital, and Astana certainly delivers this. And so, how big is big? So, a little bit of a scale comparison. You can see this is London at the top, and this is the route from Buckingham Palace on the left to Trafalgar Square on the right along the Mall. The next plan below is of Paris, and this is from the Arc de Triomphe along the Champs-Élysées along to the Louvre. And then you have Astana below, and you can see Astana is an impressive city in terms of its scale. It's much bigger than some of the other large capitals of the world. So, and also Kazakhstan, or in Astana, you have some impressive buildings. And these buildings, they take their references from all over the world, from other civilizations, whether it be Egypt and the pyramid, or from classical architecture from Greece and from Rome for the Opera House. But is Astana, is it a city about the postcard experience? What do these buildings, what does the city really say about Kazakhstan? Is it a city to look at, or is it a city to live in? And I personally, myself, I find sometimes I don't see the people. I meet you, but I don't see what Astana says really about the Kazakh people. And perhaps I can understand why a grand capital should be built, but perhaps now is time to really look at the human scale, look at the people of Kazakhstan and what you bring to the city and how you create the identity and the uniqueness of Kazakhstan, of Astana. So I'll use a few examples to kind of describe my point. So I don't know, do you recognize the building in this image? Does anyone recognize where this is? Berlin, exactly. It's the Brandenburg Gate. And you see the Germans, they also used architecture from other civilizations to create acceptance and recognition within the world. And this Berlin was kind of formed as the capital of the German Empire in 1871. And in many ways, Berlin and Astana are very similar. They're both manufactured capitals. Their major industries are about commerce and the government and administration. And yet, the city was in crisis in many ways. It was conceived as a city without history, and I find that quite amazing to understand. But 30 years ago, the city was trying to see how it could reinvent itself. It was in a bad way. It had, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was looking at ways it could rejuvenate itself. And they looked towards tourism as a way of maybe creating additional revenue for the city itself. And they looked at, and they tried to think about what tourism would make. What is a tourist city? What does this mean? And in many ways, touristification of Berlin has changed it more than any other city. So the city looked at what it could do, and they created a story. They created an anniversary, the 750th anniversary of Berlin. It's a notional idea. The first mention of Berlin was 750 years previously. So they conceived an exhibition, an international building exhibition. And this is not an exhibition in the gallery. They used the city. They invited architects from all over the world to come and build in their city and add to the eclectic nature of the buildings within the city itself. This building by Peter Eisenman, an American architect. And they used this as a way of generating new interest in the city. They also understood that tourists move in a very different way in a city to the inhabitants. The locals, they travel from their house to their place of work in a direct way, whereas tourists move in a very different way. They move from tourist attraction to tourist attraction. And so the city designers of Berlin, they understood this, and they created a way of people to move easily within the city, from location to location. They also have a brilliant transport system. Their public transport system is excellent, from the trams, the metro, but also they've created a lot of connectivity for other modes of transport as well. And it not only improves the lives of the tourists, makes it easier, it gives them a better experience, but it gives, it kind of enhances the experience of the city for the people who live there as well. It makes it easier to get around. I lived in Berlin for 2 years, and you can cycle pretty much anywhere you like within the city in 45 minutes. The other thing that they've done is they've created a series of temporary exhibitions. So this is the Reichstag about 20 years ago. They invited the artist Christo to wrap the Reichstag before it was converted into the new Parliament building. And this is a very clever idea because it brings people back again and again and again. So more recently, there's this installation called Lichtgrenze, and this means light border. And the Lichtgrenze, it mimics the path that the Berlin Wall took through the city, and this was to commemorate the 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so what lessons could Astana learn from Berlin? And maybe it's about connectivity. So my next example is another secret country, Oman. And it's a country which is less known than its neighbors from the UAE, from Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Qatar, perhaps. But it has a unique offer, and they've been looking at how they address their tourism offer, if you like. This is their new campaign, and you can see it's very, very different to the campaigns you might see for somewhere like Dubai, for example. It's not showing, beaches. It's not about luxury. It's not about providing, martinis on the beach. But it's about something much more complex. This is the capital of Oman. In fact, this is called Matra. It's a port which is part of Muscat, the capital itself. And Oman has been very clever. They've avoided the trap of building tall skyscrapers in their cities. It's very different to Dubai. The landscape does the work for it. This is Nizwa Valley. So a lot of the country is very arid, but then you have these very intense green oases within the country itself. And to the south of the country, then you have a very different climate indeed. This is the area called Dhofar. And Dhofar has a microclimate, it has a monsoon climate. So traditionally, people from the Arab worlds would travel to Dhofar in the summer because it's much cooler than the rest of the region. And as you can see, it's an intensive green color. It's also the region where frankincense is from. So for the last 2 years, I've been very lucky to be involved with the Muscat Youth Summit. And the Muscat Youth Summit is organized by a government agency called IFRA, and they look at investment and promotion in Oman. Each year, they invite 100 students, young people really, between the ages of 18 and 24. They invite them to the summit, which takes it's 5 days residential experience, and they give them a series of challenges. And this year, it was set in Dhofar, this region in the south of Oman. And we were split into groups, and we have to come up with ideas for looking at the tourism offer, but not about the traditional tourism offer, but how the country might offer something different, something quite unique. So this is a town of Mirbat. This is close to where we're staying in Dhofar. And our job, our task for our group was really looking at sustainable tourist accommodation. And there was an impression that we would actually come up with an idea for modern methods of construction or new technologies, for example. But the students, they came up with a really interesting idea. They'd seen places like Mirbat on the coast, and they'd seen that that these villages, people still live there, but they were semi-abandoned. Incredibly beautiful towns located on the sea. And Mirbat was once one of the most important ports. It's a place where frankincense was shipped from, and where horses were traded. But now it looks like this, and it's a little sad and tired. And the students realized that actually these are the perfect buildings for sustainable tourist accommodation. They're using local materials, local techniques. The buildings are well adapted to the environment. They've developed over hundreds of years. And so they looked at the village, and they started to survey it. Some buildings were more dilapidated than others, but they made a survey of which buildings were still occupied, which buildings were derelicts, which buildings were semi-derelicts, and which buildings were passable, just needed a bit of help. And we focused on one building as a case study. We looked at this building. It's by the coast, with great views, and you can see part of it has fallen away, but the basic building is still there. So we reimagined the building, rebuilt, using local techniques, local labour. The interiors were using, again, done in a very traditional way, maybe using local crafts to decorate them. And you can see there's no air conditioning in the building. It's not needed. We actually measured the temperature. On the outside, we had 38 degrees. On the inside, 23 degrees. It kind of speaks for itself, really. Some of the views from around it. And the view from the terrace looking out over the sea and to the rest of Dhofar. And there's 3 interesting lessons. It provides sustainable tourist accommodation. It also, it's a socially responsible project. It kind of provides work for local people. It kind of creates a more sustainable community. But it also is looking at creating an authentic experience. This couldn't be anywhere else but Oman. And so I think this project is very clever. And actually, one of the interesting things is that there are 1,096 settlements in Oman. So you can imagine the potential for this type of project is incredible. And the students, they won the competition, and they've been given the opportunity to try and develop this as a business. So could there be some lessons from Oman that could be employed in Kazakhstan or in Astana? Lessons could be close to home. And so maybe we'll look at Almaty. And Almaty is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. There's no doubt to this. And I think part of the secret, or the reason for this, is really the way the city sits within the landscape. And that can be described through this section. You always have the mountains as the backdrop. You have relatively sort of domestic scale streets, wide sidewalks. You have the ariks running through the streets, carrying the water from the mountains, and then a richly planted streetscape. And there's also another level of detail. The architects of Almaty, the Soviet architects of Almaty, were real rebels, and they introduced all sorts of Kazakh patterns and motifs into the buildings. Even the most mundane buildings are covered in these beautiful patterns, and it kind of really enriches the city. And so there's also something here about Kazakh culture that kind of comes through in the design of the city itself. I'm a newcomer really to Kazakhstan, but over the past few months I've come in contact with some young Kazakh designers. This is Astana Kazava, and she is a fashion designer. She's a Kazakh fashion designer based in Milan. But you can see, how Kazakh motifs form a big part of her work. But you wouldn't say her her work is traditional necessarily. It's quite innovative, and it's kind of reinvents a lot of Kazakh clothing. This is Arsen Rizdolyatov, and he was a banker, but he has now become an organic farmer in Almaty. And he's a champion of the apple, really. And he's created a project to introduce families from Almaty to come and work on a farm, and stay on the farm and help with the harvest and become a lot more connected with the landscape once again. This is Akmarel Zakhaeva. She's a musician, composer, and a singer. And she works with traditional Kazakh music, folk music, and instruments, but she also combines it with electronic music and really bringing traditional Kazakh music to a new audience. And this is the work of Asel Yashanova and Dastan Disyan. And they're both architects and designers, and they have taken the theme of the apple for the design of a cafe. And so it really goes through from everything. It's the graphic design, the branding, and the design of the space itself. Taking the motif of the apple being intrinsic to Almaty, but also looking to the Soviet architecture to kind of inspire some of the decoration and the design of the building itself. All your history is relevant, really, to your identity. So what of Almaty? Sorry, Astana. How could these approaches, how could a greater connectivity, how could an air of authenticity and the ideas of tradition, how could they help form a new Astana? So let's take a typical street in Astana, maybe the street which is outside. You have long avenues. It's a slave to the car. There's 8 lanes of traffic with parking either side. The cars form a barrier to social interaction, and the size of the streets and the linear aspect of the streets really exacerbates the effects of the sun and of the wind. It doesn't feel like it's a city which is adjusted to its environment. So what could you do? Just by some very simple things, maybe just putting the roads on a diet. You don't need the cars at all, because in Astana you've got the most amazing public transport system. You've done it before with domesticating the horse. Why not create the most amazing public transport system that is the envy of the world? It is an honor to travel on this public transport system. And then incorporating cycle lanes into the city as well. And then looking at the ways people walk through the city, covered walkways, and a city that changes and adapts. So in summer, maybe it encourages the wind into the streets, but in the winter, it then shades the wind from the streets itself, making it a more comfortable environment. Maybe the walkways have started to become more covered as well. This is an adaptable and changing city. So to summarize, I imagine Astana as an adaptive and changing city, a nomadic city. Not a city which walks and moves around, but a city that is nomadic in its ideas. So, thank you very much.